Welcome to On Texas Football. Time for State of the Program. I'm Bobby Burton, joined by Gerry Hamilton and CJ Vogel of On Texas Football. This episode brought to you by our friends over at loweylawfirm.com. Adam Lowy and the guys doing good work for folks. All right, hey, CJ and Gerry, I figured that today in State of the Program, we would really talk a lot about the team itself and what we're hearing because CJ, Gerry, myself, we've all heard some things behind the scenes that we want to get out there and talk to people about. We're going to talk about team leadership today and what we're hearing. We're going to talk about some guys that we're hearing are having good summer workouts now that we're almost a full month into that as well, and some other issues facing the team as well. Before we do that, we want to say thank you to Adam Lowy and the Lowy Law Firm. If you've been injured in a car wreck, truck wreck, automobile accident of any time, make sure you give Adam and his team a shout over at loweylawfirm.com. They'll give you a free, no strings attached consultation to see whether or not you and yours might be due compensation. Again, loweylawfirm.com. Thank you, Adam. All right, let's start with team leaders. It's a topic that Steve Sarkisian has broached at times on a couple of different interviews he's given. It's something that Arch Manning mentioned. It's something that we're hearing from behind the scenes. Other than Arch Manning, who we believe is stepping into that role quite confidently, I think is the best way to put that. Would everybody, before we go to the individual positions and some other guys, would y'all agree with me, Gerry and CJ, that from everything y'all hear, Arch Manning is taking the team leadership like a duck to water? Because that's what I hear from behind the scenes. Gerry, I'll start with you.
Yeah, no question. We've been hearing that since since the job was officially his. He's been waiting on this a while. And when you sit there for 2 years, one of the things when you sit is you really learn your teammates, CJ. You learn them, you study them in a different way than if you're the starting quarterback in a game. Yeah, you're paying attention to the game, but you can see how guys react. You can really learn your teammates in a setting like that. I think Arch was extremely well prepared. Anybody that's been around him knows he's got great personality. He's got moxie. He's got that competitive spirit about him. He has got all the things that guys kind of gravitate to, and that he has the ability to lift his teammates. And you saw that even going to Ryan Wingo's camp, right? I mean, all the attention that got. He is pushing all the right buttons. Why wouldn't he's a Manning?
Yeah. Hey, CJ,
if you're not prepared to be a leader of a team as a quarterback and your last name's Manning, I don't know what to tell people.
CJ, what do you think, dude? You've heard some stuff behind the scenes a little bit different than me and Gerry. What have you heard about Arch and what you maybe learned out at the Manning Passing Academy too?
Yeah, I mean, if you're not equipped to be a leader of a football team with last name Manning, you might have gotten dropped off by the UPS truck, right? That's kind of how that goes. So
the stork delivered you instead of right.
That's exactly it. But for Arch specifically, I mean, look, going back to his freshman year, when he first arrived on campus, what did you hear? You heard that he was just one of the guys. He was cool, calm, collected. He didn't want to make it anything more than what it was about himself arriving on campus. He understood where he was in the pecking order of the Texas quarterback depth chart, and he just bided his time. And now that it is his time, you're starting to see that leadership. You're starting to see the lead by example. That work ethic was always there, but now it's come to a point where he's the one, obviously, setting up the throwing sessions, getting 7-on-7 orchestrated for these guys during the offseason. He's taken the reins, as we've talked about, being handed the keys to the facility, saying, make sure that these guys are getting their work in. And this offseason, he's doing just that. Going out to the Manning Passing Academy, look, obviously the name's on the name of the camp, right? He's a big attraction, but sitting there talking to him, you wouldn't have known that. You wouldn't have known that this was the most coveted high school or college quarterback at the camp, given what the circumstances of the camp were. But he sat there with that confidence of, yeah, it's a fun game. I get to go out there with my teammates, with my best friends, and be a part of it. So I think that's one of the big takeaways for me is, yes, he's going to be ultra competitive this fall, but ultimately he's going out there to do this with a group of guys that he's grown very close with over the last 3 years. And I think that's something that shouldn't be taken lightly going into the 25 season.
He is not the only leader of this team, though. I mean, no. We've heard some guys stepping up behind the scenes, in particular, one, Cole Hudson, and I'll talk a little bit about that. I've heard Cole Hudson is the one that's organizing the O-line workouts. DJ Campbell is there as a vocal supporter of that, if that makes sense. There's a little bit of a, hey, we're going to do it this way from Cole. He's the one in the group chats telling the players. And then there's kind of an extra enforcer in DJ Campbell. I think that's a good sign because they needed senior leadership because, frankly, after Jake Majors left this past season to go to the NFL, that was a big hole left because Jake Majors has been the guy for 3 years. And so Cole Hudson, look, these games are going to be won in large part up front at times. And I think that Cole Hudson stepping into that role has been big for the university.
Well, your center has to be your offensive line leader, in my estimation. I mean, look, people talked about Kelvin Banks the last 3 years, but Jake Majors was the leader of the offense. They lead the communication. They're the guy with the ball in their hands before the play. I mean, they're the guy that's communicating with the quarterback, then sequencing it out to their left and to their right. The center position is always an undervalued leadership position. And especially when you go on the road, if that guy is not in control of everything, then you have issues as an offense. And I think Cole Hudson, I always go back to and I'm sure CJ had the same conversation with Cole Hudson. When he was a senior at Frisco, I went up to the school, and he's one of the rare kids that didn't play center that said, I want to play center. So he had been waiting for this opportunity for a while. And I think Daniel Cruz would be a tremendous player in the future. He's been waiting on this for a while. He's been studying this. He is prepared for this. Now, when you get in front of 110,000 people, you still have to deliver. But he's been preparing for this from a communication standpoint, a leadership position, for the last 3 years, waiting on his opportunity to be the center once Jake Majors graduated. And I think he is really well prepared for this. I think he understands the role.
Hey, CJ, you hearing anything in that regard? Any other guys that you're hearing that are stepping up as leaders as well?
Yeah, on the offensive side of the ball specifically, I know Cole's been one that's been pointed out on the offensive line. You got to point to DeAndre Moore. And I think when you look at guys that do it the right way, Moore comes to mind almost immediately. Gerry, Bobby, we saw him firsthand a few springs ago, the first out there, every single practice, leading the way in a room in which he did not have a true carved out position. He went out and earned it. And now coming into this year, he's expected to be one of the top 2 guys for the Longhorns at the receiving position. But he's done that just about every practice, right? He's made that a focal point of what he wants to be remembered for at Texas is getting there early, getting, first on the field, one of the last to leave, and it's been working, right? We've seen the progression. Aside from him, look, I think you got to go to running back. CJ Baxter will be in that conversation once he gets back on the field. Of course, it's hard not to be kind of encapsulated when you're around him. He's got that kind of personality that attracts, but Trey Wisner is a guy that I always get mentioned to, just a guy that teammates love. They love to be around him. And we saw his freshman year, the effort that he puts in just to get on the field as a low 3-star guy in the class, not one of those headline guys when he arrived at campus, yet he's a favorite in the locker room. And he's someone that is very easy to rally around, but he does it the right way. Very much a lead by example, but also a guy that you lean on regardless of position elsewhere.
Defensively, I'm going to say this. Michael Taft has been called out to me. Jelani McDonald's been called out. Anthony Hill has been maybe the most vocal leader. I'm not saying he's the leader for the whole team, but he has been extraordinarily vocal. Colin Simmons as well. There are a number of guys on defense right now that could be in that role. Jalen Gilbo, just remember that name a little bit too. He's got so much experience now and has been around a long time. Defensively, I think those are it. Gerry, you have anybody else on defense? Or
Trey Moore. Look, what Trey is, he may not be the most boisterous voice, but I think he has leadership qualities. Look, Sark talked about last spring after his transfer, right, when he came in. That's very rare to hear coaches talk about a guy right out of the gate that way. I think he's got a different way about him. But I think what Trey Moore did too was he came back for another year at Texas. And when you come back for another year and you say, I want to develop my game, I'm going to work at linebacker. He's doing everything he can on a day-to-day basis to maximize his talent. And sometimes those guys don't have to be boisterous, but it can be a real smart communicated message of here's my everyday, what I do every day. I hear Trey Moore continues to be one of those guys.
Going back to the secondary, I think it's really interesting because what was it a year ago? It was Michael Taft, it was Jahdae Barron, kind of as the true vocal pieces of your defense, right? They made sure that the locker room was in order, the defense was in check. They were basically the faces of your defense a year ago, despite, all the talent in the front seven. But that's obviously trickled into Jelani. That's trickled down into even a Kobe Black. And what's interesting is, where do these guys all hang out with outside of football? Well, it's a lot of it's at those training sessions with Band Performance, Bernard Blake in the Austin area. And I think the more that you spend time with a Jahdae, the more time that you spend with a Michael Taft, the more that this leadership kind of trickles down onto you, and you're starting to reap the rewards of that. And that's ultimately just the sign of a healthy culture in the locker room. As one class leaves and the others arrive, you got that same level of intensity and leadership ready at the drop of a hat, basically.
I think overall, what we're all saying is Texas is in good hands right now from a leadership perspective. They've got plenty of leaders. It's like, goes back to what Sark talked about when he first got there. There were one or two. Now he's got a plethora. He's got a number of different positions, et cetera. So that's really good. The question I had next, and the topic I want to get to is more of what we're hearing behind the scenes from a development standpoint. I'll start off with tight ends. Okay. And we can take positions. I'll ask you, CJ, a couple of positions. Gerry, I'll ask you. I've heard that both Amari Winston and Nick Townsend are doing exceedingly well from a young player perspective. Now, Townsend just showed up on campus 30 days ago, exactly, almost, right? June 1st, excuse me. My point in saying that is Texas right now feels really good about a tight end room that heading into the spring was really decimated because Jordan Washington got injured, and all of a sudden it was Spencer Shannon, Will Randall, and Amari Winston, and that was it. They've now gotten Jack Indries, who is taking really well to the offense. Jordan Washington is back and healthier, and then you add in Nick Townsend. They feel like the tight end position may be as talented as they've had it at Texas.
I agree.
That is pretty strong because they've got 5 guys right now that they feel have a real chance to be contributors for them long term. You guys have any position you want to start with? CJ, why don't you talk a little bit about running backs and what you're hearing, because another name has come into the conversation that we've been high on from the get-go, but a little bit different now.
Yeah, I've heard it's been a great offseason for Christian Clark. Coming off of the Achilles, obviously he made some headlines when he recovered so quickly in the spring, but he's turned that into a lot of momentum to getting on the field early, and I've heard that he's been kind of that second running back behind a Trey Wisner at the moment to go through, some of these passing drills when they get to 7-on-7, when they work together individually in the offseason. He's been that next guy up. Of course, he and Jarrett Gibson are going to be battling for those next reps behind a Trey Wisner until we get the green light from CJ Baxter, which is where I was going to go next. Because, look, he's increasing his workload in these offseason workouts, and that's a great positive. I still think there's a ways to go until we see him on the field. Does that mean he might get a snap or two against Ohio State? It could. I'm not going to necessarily bet on it. But I will say that the more that you're starting to hear about the young guys, and Gerry, you've been very high on James Simon all the way throughout. Bobby, you as well. But this room is getting deeper, and it's getting closer and closer to being a true strength of this group. Still, I think one of the biggest positives is that return for Christian Clark and really what we've heard behind the scenes in terms of him climbing his way up the pecking order.
If he's back, that gives competition to Jarrett Gibson. It gives competition to James Simon. It just improves that gives them a potential of really looking at 3 better backs going into a season. That could be a really, really important note. Especially as we head to Columbus, Ohio.
Yeah,
CJ. Because I don't think CJ Baxter will be ready, not full go by Ohio State. Gerry, you have any positions or players you want to talk about behind the scene?
No, look, I think offensive line. I think the young kids, Texas really likes their depth on the interior, the young players in the program, whether that's Cruz at center, whether that's Nate Kibble, whether that's some of the other guards. Jackson Christian, a redshirt, but had a good spring, showed well. So then you have Devin and Jordan Coleman coming. I think it's going to be interesting to see where Devin Coleman ends up. Will it be center or will it be guard? I think you'd be either one. Jordan Coleman, likely guard, but those are two powerful kids, two very powerful kids that came in June. I think Texas really likes their young guys on the interior and where that's headed. I think one of the interesting things will be, again, Nick Brooks looked tremendous when he walked by CJ. And I mean, and I saw him as a senior. His body, he's doing great work there physically. CJ and I saw him in June. But I continue to hear great things about him as well. Brandon Baker looked great physically in June as well. And Andre Kojo looks older. I'll say that. He actually looks older now. But I've heard Texas is very pleased with where they're at. They really like the depth of the offensive line. Now, some of those guys you won't even see this year. You'll see them on the sidelines, but they like the depth.
One other name we need to mention, Bobby, on the offense side of the ball, Kalik Lockett. Arch Manning mentioned him at the Manning Passing Academy as one of the youngsters standing out in the receiving room. That's a big positive based off of a solid spring for Kalik getting up to speed with the playbook. I still think is one of those things that all young wide receivers are getting into the true fashion of. But for Kalik to be shouted out by Arch is quite the nod of approval so far.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I was going to go to wide receiver because I talked to somebody about them yesterday. I was told of the freshman Dalen McCutcheon, who we knew was kind of ahead coming in because of his play at Lovejoy. He's kind of in that role, He's been ahead of the group. And then Kalik Lockett had been coming on this summer, really. So that's two. Jamie French and Michael Terry, obviously, in that as well. But, one of the things that I was told is that Emmett Mosley is extraordinarily athletic, like hyper athletic. That's not something we necessarily thought of when we saw him play at Stanford. And it's not something you think of when you think of a Stanford wide receiver either, right? You think of this big, tall kind of guy that just kind of gets by people, but apparently his athleticism has been showing out a little bit. Obviously add that into what you said earlier about DeAndre Moore and Ryan Wingo, CJ, and you've got another group. I'll just take one last take at this, and some other players I've heard about, Justice Terry and Lance Jackson. Texas extremely pleased with what's going on there from what I'm being told. Have y'all heard anything more on the defensive line that y'all want to add to that? Whether go for it, Gerry.
The entire freshman defensive line, Sharman, Charles, and while you don't know how much they're going to play this year because the older guys in the rotation, but I've been told multiple times Texas loves the entire freshman group. They love they think all those guys are going to be players. Obviously you have to stay healthy, do all the right things, but if they stay on the progression, Texas feels like they did very well at that position as a whole in the class, which they should. It's the number one ranked class.
CJ, I want to come back and ask you about the secondary and about linebacker maybe. But before we do that, I want to say thank you again to our sponsor. That's Adam Lowy over at the Lowy Law Firm. If you've been injured in a car wreck, truck wreck, automobile accident of any type, make sure you give Adam and his group a shout. Reach out to them at loweylawfirm.com. They've had 20-plus years of experience of helping injured Texans. Texas Law School grad, Adam Lowy. Make sure you reach out to him. All right, CJ, we talk about the secondary and linebacker, and we mentioned Anthony Hill as that vocal centerpiece. But there are other people that we're hearing about behind the scenes. One of them is Anthony Smith. What are you hearing at linebacker and in the secondary?
I think one of the big names you have to mention is Brad Spence. Coming over from Arkansas, we've heard about him in the spring. We've heard about him in the summer, and we're going to hear his name in the fall as well. A guy that's come down, head down, ready to work, and certainly has, the skins on the wall to prove that he is capable of competing and certainly contributing at a high level. But he gets the subtle nods every now and then, whether it be Sark, whether it be guys behind the scenes, it's always kind of, he looks good. And then those start to pile up as the offseason continues. So worth mentioning him once again. And then moving to the secondary, look, one of the names that I've heard at kind of that star spot is Wardell Mack. I thought that he had a solid spring. He's been a guy that's been pointed out a few times in the offseason as well. And that gives you more of that versatility. If maybe you have a Cade Phillips, maybe you have a Kobe Black or a Grayson Littleton really start to push for that outside cornerback spot opposite of Manny Muhammad. Well, now you have a strong competition between Jalen Gilbo and Wardell Mack at star, and it just gives you more of that depth that Sarkisian mentioned last year was so valuable as you go into a 15, perhaps 16-game season.
When y'all talk about that, that's what we talked about on Coffee and Football this morning, CJ and Gerry. There's not a position on the field right now where a starting player is not being pushed by an eventual NFL player. Think about that. The backup is a potential NFL player. That's the depth and what's happening. And so when you hear those positive remarks, like you're hearing about Wardell Mack, like we've heard, I think it's important. I mentioned Anthony Smith, by the way, and I did that on purpose because Steve Sarkisian in an interview said he's a future star.
Yeah.
Now those are big words for a guy that did not play a ton last year, and the linebacker room looks pretty darn good as it is, but worth mentioning there. All right, that's going to do it for this week's State of the Program. Thank you very much to Adam Lowy again, our sponsor at the Lowy Law Firm, as well as thank you to CJ Vogel and Gerry Hamilton for those two, as well as myself and our producer, Matt Hutchison. This has been State of the Program on Texas Football. We'll be back with more later today. Book of Horns.